The judge's gavel came down hard. Life! A black teenager sentenced to die behind bars as his mother collapsed in tears. Yet just 2 days earlier, he was only a kid delivering groceries for his mom. A gun appeared in his van, a friend was forced to lie, and the system closed in to bury him alive. But Malik stood tall, made one phone call, and the truth shook America. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled, the air heavy with whispers and the occasional cough that echoed far too loudly in the stillness. Fluorescent lights hummed above, but they did little to warm the chill seeping from the stone walls. At the front, Judge William Gray sat high on his bench, his expression carved from granite, the black of his robe hanging stiff around him like a funeral shroud. He tapped the gavel once, not in hesitation but in warning, and the entire room stilled. Malik Johnson sat at the defense table, his wrists bound in cuffs that clinked when he shifted slightly in his chair. 17 years old, barely old enough to vote, but here he was being weighed as though the rest of his life could be discarded with a flick of someone else's wrist. His dark eyes lifted toward the judge, steady but hollow, as if bracing for a storm already overhead. His attorney sat beside him, papers shuffled nervously, lips pursed but saying nothing of comfort. Across the aisle, the prosecutor leaned back, smug in the knowledge that the verdict was already written long before today. "Defendant, rise," the bailiff commanded. Malik stood, the chains rattling faintly, the sound more deafening to his mother than any thunderclap. She sat in the second row, both hands clasped over her mouth, knuckles white, her nurse's uniform still wrinkled from the overnight shift she had barely completed before rushing here. Her eyes searched for her boy, for the child she had raised on double shifts and sacrifices, but the court saw only the outline of another case file, another statistic to be disposed of. Judge Gray adjusted his glasses and looked down at the young man before him. His voice rolled across the chamber, cold and final. On the charges brought before this court, illegal possession of a firearm, intent to assault an officer of the law, and affiliation with a criminal organization, this court finds you guilty. He paused, letting the weight of each word sink into the crowd like stones in water. And for these crimes, this court sentences you to life in prison. The gavel came down with a violent crack that made several in the room flinch. The sound wasn't just wood against wood. It was a sentence being carved into a young man's life, a door slamming shut on any dreams he might have had. The murmur that followed was immediate, a swarm of voices rising in disbelief, pity, or quiet satisfaction, depending on which side of the line people stood. Malik's mother gasped as though struck, then collapsed against the woman beside her. "No, no," she whispered hoarsely, tears streaming down her face. "He's just a boy. My boy." The bailiff moved to steady her, but the sound of her grief rippled through the courtroom like a wound everyone could feel, but no one would heal. Malik closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, holding back the wave that threatened to crush him. He had prepared for this possibility, though the reality still felt like his lungs had been filled with ice. Judge Gray leaned forward, his gaze sharp, his lips curling with something close to disdain. "Perhaps this will teach you, young man, that actions have consequences. Perhaps it will teach your community as well." His words weren't aimed at Malik alone, but at every black face in that courtroom, as if one boy could serve as an example for them all. Malik's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering, "We'll appeal, we'll file." But his voice cracked with a lack of conviction, drowned out by the echo of the gavel that still reverberated in Malik's ears. The prosecutor gathered his papers with a satisfied snap of his folder, exchanging a quick nod with the bailiff. Outside the windows, the sky was a dull winter gray, as though it too refused to offer light to this moment. For a long breath, Malik remained standing, his chest rising and falling with measured control. His eyes wandered the crowd. A couple of reporters scribbling notes, a white-haired veteran of the town shaking his head in judgment, two teenagers in the back shifting uncomfortably because this boy on trial was not much older than them. Then his gaze found his mother again, crumpled in grief, clutching her rosary beads with trembling hands. The urge to break, to shout, to let the anger spill into the room was strong. But something inside Malik resisted. He clenched his jaw instead, forcing the tears to stay buried. He had been told all his life that his voice would not be heard in a place like this. But silence could be its own weapon. Judge Gray picked up another case file, already moving on, as though Malik were nothing more than a page turned, a statistic logged, forgotten by the time the next name was called. But Malik did not sit down. He did not bow his head in defeat. Instead, he lifted his chin ever so slightly, his gaze steady on the bench. Inside, a thought burned, quiet but unyielding. This isn't the end. The courtroom may have believed it had witnessed the final chapter of his story, sealed with the echo of a gavel. Yet beneath the surface of that silence, a storm was building, and Malik knew, though no one else in the room did, that the man Judge Gray had just consigned to a lifetime behind bars was not alone. His father had yet to arrive. 2 days before the gavel fell, the morning sun stretched over the cracked sidewalks of Eastwood, the kind of neighborhood where every corner store was more than a place to buy milk and bread. It was survival. Malik Johnson pushed open the metal gate behind his mother's tiny grocery, his breath turning to fog in the cold air. He balanced 2 boxes on his shoulder, grumbling to himself, but with a faint smile. His mother had begged him to help with deliveries before heading to school. She looked so worn out coming home from her night shift at the hospital, and he couldn't refuse her. The battered delivery van sat waiting, paint peeling, the side door dented from years of use. Malik slid the boxes into the back and tapped the side of the van, as if coaxing an old friend to keep moving just a little longer. "Come on, girl, we've got work to do," he muttered. He checked his phone, 2 missed texts from his best friend asking about basketball practice, and one from his mother reminding him to keep the receipts. It was an ordinary morning, so painfully ordinary that he never could have guessed how fast everything would tilt. As he pulled onto Jefferson Avenue, the radio hummed low, a gospel station his mother always kept tuned in. Malik drove carefully, cautious of the potholes that could rip the shocks out of their tired van. He had a sense of responsibility beyond his years, the kind that comes from being the man of the house too early. With his father away most of the time, Malik learned quickly that there was no room for mistakes. He thought about the upcoming exam at school, about the college applications he hadn't yet finished, about how proud his mom would be if he got into the engineering program he dreamed of. The flashing red and blue lights came out of nowhere. A police cruiser lurched into his lane, sirens blaring, forcing him to brake hard. His heart leapt into his throat. Malik's hands tightened around the wheel as he pulled to the curb. He swallowed, already rehearsing the words his mother drilled into him. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly. Don't argue. Officer Daniels stepped out of the car, broad-shouldered and smirking beneath the brim of his hat. He was known in the neighborhood, and not for kindness. Daniels tapped on the window with the edge of his flashlight. Malik rolled it down slowly, both hands on the wheel. "Morning, officer," Malik said, steady as he could. "License and registration," Daniels barked, eyes darting past Malik into the van's back seat. Malik handed over the documents, his stomach twisting. Daniels flipped through them carelessly before leaning down, his gaze sharpening. "Step out of the vehicle, son." Confusion flashed in Malik's chest. "Did I do something wrong, sir? I was just making deliveries for my mom." "Step out." Daniel's voice cut like a blade. Malik obeyed, stepping onto the cracked sidewalk, the winter air biting through his hoodie. Daniels yanked the van's back door open, rummaging through the boxes without a word. Cans clattered onto the pavement. Malik opened his mouth to protest, then shut it again, his mother's voice echoing in his head. "Don't give them a reason." A moment later, Daniels straightened, holding something heavy and dark in his gloved hands. The metallic glint caught Malik's eye before his mind registered what it was. A gun. Not theirs. Not his. He froze, his mouth dry. Well, Daniels drawled, lifting the weapon for effect. "What do we have here?" Malik shook his head furiously. "That's not mine. I swear I don't know where that came from. Please, you have to believe me." Daniels smirked, tilting the gun in the air. "Kids like you always have excuses. Don't worry, we'll sort it out downtown." Panic surged through Malik, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "Sir, please. I work for my mom. This is just groceries. Check the receipts, the invoices, everything's there." Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Malik could hear. "Doesn't matter. You fit the description, and today, I need a win." Before Malik could process the words, a cold steel clamped around his wrists. The cuffs bit into his skin as Daniels pushed him toward the cruiser. A small group of bystanders had gathered, drawn by the flashing lights. Their faces blurred together, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath. "Thought he was a good kid," someone whispered. "Knew he'd end up in trouble," another said. The shame was worse than the fear. Malik's chest burned as Daniels shoved him into the back seat. Through the window, he caught sight of the boxes still strewn across the sidewalk, cans rolling into the gutter, the groceries his mother had worked herself sick to buy. The van looked abandoned, violated. As the cruiser pulled away, Malik pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He thought of his mother, of how she would blame herself for asking him to help. He thought of the college application still half written on his desk. He thought of the life he wanted, and the life being stolen from him in a single morning. The siren wailed, cutting through the city streets, and Malik felt the walls close in. 2 days later, a judge would bring down the gavel, and the world would call it justice. But in that moment, shackled in the back of a cruiser, Malik already knew the truth. This wasn't justice at all. It was a trap, carefully laid, and he had walked right into it. The holding cell smelled of bleach and old sweat, the kind of smell that clung to the walls no matter how often the guards mopped the floor. Malik sat on the cold bench, his arms wrapped tightly around himself, trying not to let the tremor in his hands show. Hours had crawled by since Daniels had dragged him in. No one had explained what would happen next. No one cared. He was just another teenager in chains, waiting for the system to grind him down. Finally, the heavy door creaked open, and a man in a wrinkled gray suit stepped inside, clutching a briefcase far too large for the papers inside. He couldn't have been much older than his late 20s, his hair already thinning at the crown, his tie loosened like it was choking him. His eyes were kind but weary, as if he had walked into rooms like this one too many times and never once walked out with a real victory. "Malik Johnson?" he asked, his voice cautious. Malik nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, that's me." The man set down his briefcase and offered his hand. "I'm Alex Carter. I've been assigned to represent you, Public Defender's Office." Malik hesitated before shaking his hand. Alex's grip was warm but unsteady, a handshake that told Malik everything he needed to know. This man was all he had, and it wasn't nearly enough. They said I had a gun in the van," Malik stammered. "That's not true. I was just delivering groceries. It's a setup." Alex opened his case, shuffling papers already creased and stained with coffee rings. "I read the report. Officer Daniels claims he discovered the weapon during a lawful search. He's testifying that you matched the description of a suspect connected to a gang shooting last week." Malik's head snapped up. "That's insane. I don't even know anyone in the gang. I was working for my mom. Everyone in the neighborhood knows that. You can check with her, with the customers. There has to be a way to prove." "I believe you," Alex said quickly, raising his hands as if to calm him. "I do. But belief isn't the same as evidence, Malik. And the prosecution has Daniels, a veteran cop with a spotless record on paper. Juries listen to men like him. Judges trust men like him." "Even when he's lying?" Malik asked bitterly. Alex sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Especially when he's lying. That's what makes this hard." The words sank into Malik like stones. He leaned back against the wall, staring up at the cracked ceiling. His whole body ached, not from the cuffs or the cold bench, but from the weight pressing down on him. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being told that truth alone would never be enough. The door opened again, and his mother rushed in, escorted by a guard. Her face was pale from exhaustion, her eyes rimmed red from hours of crying. She knelt beside him, taking his cuffed hands in hers. "Baby," she whispered, her voice trembling, "are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine, Ma," Malik murmured, though he wasn't. Seeing her broken like this hurt more than the steel around his wrists. She turned sharply to Alex. "You're his lawyer? Then get him out of here. You hear me? My son didn't do anything." Alex's mouth opened, then closed. He looked down at his papers as though they might shield him. "Mrs. Johnson, I'll do everything I can. But bail is unlikely. The charges are severe, and with the prosecutor pushing for remand, the judge will." His voice trailed off under her glare. "Unlikely? she repeated, her voice rising. That boy has worked since he was 12 years old to help me keep food on the table. He wants to be an engineer. He doesn't even jaywalk. And you're telling me you can't get him home tonight? Alex's eyes softened with sympathy. I'm saying the deck is stacked against us. I'm assigned dozens of cases like this every month. I don't have the resources to fight the way a private firm could. But I promise I'll try. Try isn't enough, she snapped. Her hand shook as she brushed a tear from her cheek. He's all I've got. Don't you dare let them bury him. Malik squeezed her hand, trying to ease her fury. Ma, it's okay. He's right. We'll figure this out. I just need you to stay strong. The guard cleared his throat, signaling her time was up. She kissed Malik's forehead, lingering as though she might never get another chance, then let herself be led out. Malik watched her go, his chest tightening until it hurt to breathe. Alex sat back down, shuffling the papers again, though nothing new had appeared in the file. Listen, Malik. The prosecutor on this case, Miles, he's ambitious. He's been angling for higher office, and he needs convictions like this to boost his record. They'll paint you as dangerous, unpredictable. They'll use every stereotype they can. We have to be ready for that. Malik stared at him. How do we fight something like that? Alex's jaw worked as he searched for an answer. Finally, he said quietly, we fight with what little we've got. Maybe a character witness, maybe a technicality in how the evidence was logged. Sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough to crack the door open. The hopelessness in his tone was impossible to miss. Malik swallowed hard, anger and fear mixing until it tasted like bile. He wanted to scream that this wasn't enough, that he deserved more than scraps of effort and half-baked defenses. But he also knew Alex wasn't the enemy. He was just another piece in a broken machine, worn down to the nub. When the guard came to take Malik back to his cell, Alex stood and straightened his tie as though bracing himself for a battle he already knew he would lose. I'll see you in court, Malik, he said. Hold on until then. Malik nodded, though inside he wondered how much longer he could hold on. As the door clanged shut behind him, he realized that hope was now a fragile thread, fraying at both ends, and the man tasked with protecting him was already running out of rope. The courthouse loomed like an ancient fortress, its marble pillars gray with soot and history, the kind of building that seemed designed to crush anyone who entered with its sheer weight. Malik was led inside, wrists bound, the scrape of his sneakers echoing on the polished floor. His mother trailed close behind, trying to keep pace, clutching her purse as though it were the only anchor she had left. Every step through those halls felt less like justice and more like a march towards sacrifice. In a side room, Prosecutor Miles was already waiting, sleeves rolled neatly at his elbows, hair slicked back, the smile on his face more suited to a campaign poster than a courtroom. He carried himself like a man rehearsing for higher office, every gesture calculated for maximum effect. On the table before him were folders stacked neatly, evidence photos displayed with deliberate care. Good morning, he greeted, though there was no warmth in it. His eyes flicked briefly to Malik, then lingered on Alex, the young public defender who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Let's keep this quick, shall we? I have a press conference this afternoon. Alex adjusted his tie nervously. We'd like to discuss the validity of the charges. There are serious questions about the chain of custody with the alleged weapon. Miles cut him off with a short laugh. Alleged weapon? Please. The firearm was found in the defendant's possession. Officer Daniels is a decorated veteran. The jury won't need convincing. Malik clenched his fists in his lap, fighting the urge to shout. He knew the truth didn't matter in this room. Miles wasn't talking to them. He was rehearsing for the cameras, building his case not just against Malik, but for his own career. Later that day, reporters clustered outside the courthouse steps. Flashbulbs popped as Miles strode out, his polished shoes clicking against the stone. This case is about accountability, he declared, voice amplified through microphones. We cannot allow our communities to be terrorized by young men carrying illegal firearms. We will show that the defendant acted with intent, and we will pursue the maximum penalty the law allows. Malik's mother watched the broadcast on a small television at the bodega that night, her hands trembling as she gripped a paper cup of coffee. Neighbors stood around her, murmuring, "They're making him into some kind of monster. one woman whispered. That boy's never hurt a soul. But the damage was done. The story had spread. Headlines branded Malik a gang affiliate. His schoolmates whispered in hallways, some avoiding his name, others repeating the lies they'd heard. Judge Gray, meanwhile, prepared in silence. His record was infamous. Harsher sentences for black and brown teenagers than their white counterparts, a reputation for zero tolerance that kept him in favor with powerful political donors. To him, Malik was just another case to prove his consistency, another line item in a career built on being merciless. That evening, Alex met with Malik in the holding room. His briefcase was open, pages scattered as he fumbled through them, sweat beading at his temple. I'm trying, Malik, he said, his voice cracking. I'm trying to find a way in, but they've locked this up tight. The prosecutor's office has influence. The judge has a reputation to uphold. It feels like we're fighting shadows. Malik leaned forward, his voice low but steady. So they can just decide? Just decide I'm guilty because it's good for their careers? Alex didn't answer right away. His silence was answer enough. Finally, he whispered, The system isn't built for kids like you. Not here. Not in this city. In the quiet that followed, Malik thought of his mother at home, trying to keep the store open, trying to scrape together enough money for rent. He thought of the neighborhood kids who looked up to him, who'd see his face on the news and learn the lesson the world wanted them to learn, that no matter how hard you tried, the system could swallow you whole. His stomach knotted with rage, but his eyes stayed calm. The next morning, the front page carried a photograph of Malik being escorted in cuffs, his head bowed, the caption reading, Teen suspect faces life for attack on officer. The truth had already been buried beneath ink and ambition. For Miles, it was the perfect campaign. For Judge Gray, it was another opportunity to flex his power. For Malik, it was the beginning of the fight of his life, one he was never supposed to win. And somewhere deep inside, in a place even fear couldn't reach, Malik began to wonder how long he could stay silent before the world finally heard his voice. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and paper, the kind of smell that clung to places where lives were measured and broken. Malik sat at the defense table in a suit too big for his narrow frame, the sleeves bunching at his wrists, a borrowed tie knotted awkwardly under his chin. He tried to keep his chin lifted, but every pair of eyes in the room seemed to weigh him down. Behind him, his mother whispered prayers under her breath, her rosary beads sliding between trembling fingers. Alex sat beside him, shuffling through his notes with hands that shook more with nerves than cold. Across the aisle, Miles, the prosecutor, leaned comfortably against his desk, radiating the confidence of a man who already knew the outcome. The judge entered, robes swaying, and the room rose to its feet. Malik's heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't just another hearing. This was the beginning of the story the world would tell about him. And the truth, he feared, had little chance of surviving here. Call your first witness, Judge Gray commanded, his voice as flat as the bench he presided over. Miles stood with deliberate calm. The state calls Officer Daniels. The sound of footsteps echoed as Daniels strode to the stand. His uniform gleamed, every crease sharp, his badge catching the overhead lights like a medal of honor. He raised his hand, swore his oath, then took his seat. Malik stared at him, bile rising in his throat. This was the man who had shoved him into the back of a cruiser, the man who had reached into his mother's boxes and found what had never been there. Officer Daniels, Miles began, his tone warm and inviting, can you tell the court what happened on the morning of March 12th? Daniels straightened, his voice practiced and sure. I observed the defendant driving erratically on Jefferson Avenue. I initiated a traffic stop. Upon searching the vehicle, I discovered a 9mm handgun concealed among boxes in the back. The defendant matched the description of a suspect involved in a shooting incident the week prior. Was the firearm loaded? Yes, sir. Fully loaded. Safety off. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Malik's mother shook her head violently, whispering, No, that's not true. Malik clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms. Miles turned smoothly. And did the defendant resist arrest? Daniels hesitated just long enough to sound believable. He appeared agitated, raised his voice. I considered him a potential threat. Thank you, officer. Miles smiled faintly, then turned to Alex. Your witness. Alex rose, adjusting his glasses nervously. His voice wavered at first. Officer Daniels, you said you observed my client driving erratically. Did you document this in your report? Daniels barely blinked. I noted it verbally to dispatch. No written record? No, sir. And the firearm you claim to have found, were there fingerprints lifted from the weapon? Daniels' lips twitched. The lab report came back inconclusive, but the weapon was within his possession. That's enough. Alex swallowed, fumbling with his notes. Officer, did you search the van before or after backup arrived? Before. The situation required immediate action. So no other officers witnessed you finding the gun? Daniels narrowed his eyes. Correct, but I stand by my integrity. Judge Gray leaned forward, his tone sharp. Counselor, unless you have something substantial, do not waste the court's time. Alex stammered. Nen, no further questions. Mullick felt his chest tighten. It was like watching a slow-motion car wreck, knowing what was happening, knowing it was wrong, but powerless to stop it. He wanted to scream at Alex, to push harder, to demand answers, but he kept silent. The cuffs on his wrists cold reminders of what would happen if he dared. Miles wasn't finished. He smirked and held up a clear evidence bag. Inside, the dark outline of the gun gleamed menacingly under the lights. Your Honor, this is the weapon recovered from the defendant's vehicle. The state will demonstrate that this firearm was consistent with shell casings found at the scene of last week's shooting. The bag was passed to the jury box. Jurors leaned forward, eyes narrowing, whispers passing between them. Mullick's heart thudded harder. He wanted to shout that the weapon wasn't his, that it had been planted, but the judge's gaze bore down like a weight pressing the air from his lungs. As if that wasn't enough, Miles's voice rang out again. The state also calls Jeremy Clark. Mullick's stomach dropped. Jeremy. A boy from his own school, someone he had known since middle school, lanky and quiet, a kid who once shared his lunch when Malik forgot his own. Jeremy shuffled to the stand, not meeting Malik's eyes. He looked smaller than Malik remembered, shoulders hunched, as though carrying a burden too heavy for him. Jeremy, Miles said gently, tell the court what you saw on the morning of March 12th. Jeremy licked his lips, his voice low. I was walking to the bus stop. I saw Malik. He was in the van. He had something in his hand. It looked like a gun. The words hit Malik like a blow to the chest. He stared at Jeremy, searching his face for some sign of truth, some flicker that said this was a mistake. But Jeremy kept his gaze fixed on the floor. No further questions, Miles said smoothly, stepping back as though the testimony were a victory parade. Alex scrambled up, his voice higher now, almost desperate. Jeremy, you've known Malik a long time, haven't you? Yes, Jeremy whispered. And in all those years, have you ever seen him with a weapon? No. Then why? Miles objected, leading the witness. Sustained, Judge Gray snapped. Alex stuttered, no further questions, and slumped back into his seat. Malik sat frozen, betrayal cutting deeper than any sentence could. Jeremy had lied. Whether out of fear, coercion, or pressure, he didn't know. But in the eyes of the jury, the picture was complete. A boy with a gun, caught red-handed, confirmed by a witness from his own community. The session adjourned for the day, but Malik's world had already shifted. As the bailiff led him back to his cell, he glanced once more at Jeremy. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and in that second, Malik saw it. The flicker of shame, of regret, buried deep but unmistakable. It didn't matter. The damage was done. In the cold silence of the holding cell that night, Malik lay awake staring at the ceiling, the betrayal replaying over and over. Daniels with his smug certainty, Miles with his rehearsed words, Jeremy with his trembling lies. The system wasn't just stacked against him, it was burying him alive. Somewhere outside these walls, life went on as though nothing had changed, but Malik knew the truth. Everything had changed, and the world was already writing him off as guilty. The cell was small, barely large enough for the two metal bunks bolted to the wall, a stainless steel toilet, and a narrow slit of a window that didn't open. The hum of the fluorescent light above mixed with the endless sounds of the jail, the clank of doors, the shuffle of guards' boots, the low murmur of voices that sometimes rose into curses or laughter. Malik sat on the lower bunk, his back against the wall, staring at the sheet of lined paper balanced on his knees. The pencil in his hand shook as he tried to form the words. He had started the letter 3 times already, crumpling the first attempts until the paper tore under his fists. Now he pressed harder, determined not to let the tears blurring his vision stain the page. Ma, I don't want you to worry, but I need you to know I didn't give up. I didn't do what they're saying. I swear on everything I love, I didn't. The words looked small, almost powerless, but they were all he had to offer. He told her to eat, to rest, to hold on until he could come home. He didn't tell her how the cell walls felt like they were closing in, or how sleep came in brief, shallow bursts, haunted by the sound of a gavel cracking like a bone. He stopped writing when the cell door rattled open and a guard barked, "New bunkmate." A tall man shuffled in, mid-40s maybe, with a heavy beard streaked with gray and eyes that had seen too much. He carried himself with the slow caution of someone who had learned long ago that sudden movements could mean trouble. "Name's Reggie," the man said, lowering himself onto the upper bunk with a groan. "Malik," he replied quietly, folding the letter and tucking it under his thin mattress. Reggie studied him for a long moment. "First time in?" Malik nodded. "Yeah. Figured. You've still got that look." "What look?" "The look of someone who thinks telling the truth is going to fix things." Malik bristled. "It should. I didn't do anything. They planted that gun. They lied." Reggie leaned over the side of the bunk, his face serious. "Kid, I've been in and out of places like this since before you were born. Truth don't mean a damn thing in here. What matters is what they can make people believe. And they already decided what they want folks to believe about you." The words cut deeper than Malik wanted to admit. He clenched his jaw, staring at the floor. "So what, I just give up?" Reggie shook his head. "Didn't say that. You fight if you can, but you gotta be ready for the fight to be dirty. You keep your head down, you stay calm, you don't let them break you. That's the only way you get through." Malik thought of his mother's voice cracking in the courtroom, of Jeremy's eyes avoiding his, of Daniel's smug testimony. A rage built inside him, hot and choking, but alongside it was fear, the kind of fear that pressed on your chest until you couldn't breathe. "I'm just a kid," he whispered, almost to himself. Reggie sighed. "That's why they came for you. Easy target. Young, black, no money. They don't care who you are, long as you fit the part they need." He paused, then added softly, "Don't let them teach you the wrong lesson, though. Don't let them make you think you're less than you are." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant clang of another cell door. Malik lay back on the thin mattress, staring up at the springs of the bunk above. He thought of the half-finished letter beneath him, of his mother's face when she kissed his forehead through the bars, of the future slipping through his fingers like sand. When the lights dimmed to signal night, he closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, his mind replayed every detail: the gun in Daniel's hand, the smug smile of the prosecutor, Jeremy's trembling voice betraying him. Each memory felt like a blade twisting deeper. He wanted to scream, but instead he whispered into the darkness, "This isn't over. It can't be over." Reggie shifted on the top bunk, his voice gravelly but steady. "Hold on to that, kid. The minute you stop saying that to yourself, that's the minute they win." Malik clung to those words like a lifeline, even as the walls pressed closer. The despair was real, heavy as the chains on his wrists, but somewhere, deep in the hollow of his chest, a faint spark refused to die. He didn't know how or when or what it would cost him, but he swore he would not let them bury him quietly. As the jail settled into uneasy silence, Malik whispered a prayer for his mother, for himself, for a future that still seemed impossible. The letter beneath his mattress remained unfinished, but in his heart, the vow had already been written. He would fight, even if the system had already chosen the ending, and he would find a way to make his voice heard, no matter how hard they tried to silence it. The morning of the sentencing dawned gray, a damp mist hanging low over the courthouse steps. Reporters gathered early, their cameras trained on the doors as though waiting for a parade. Inside, the air buzzed with the quiet murmur of conversations, every seat filled by spectators hungry for a verdict. Malik stood with his wrists shackled in front of him, escorted into the room by two deputies whose faces betrayed no feeling. He walked stiffly, the weight of the chains dragging against the floor, each clink echoing like a cruel reminder of what was about to come. His mother sat in the second row, shoulders trembling, her hands folded around the rosary beads she'd worn threadbare over the years. She whispered prayers under her breath, her lips moving quickly, as though if she spoke fast enough, she could outrun the judgment barreling toward her son. When Malik caught her eyes, he saw the fear there, but beneath it was something steadier, love that refused to bend, even under the crushing pressure of this courtroom. Alex sat beside Malik, a pale shadow of confidence. His briefcase lay open, papers spilling in disarray. He leaned close, whispering in a voice so soft only Malik could hear. "I'll argue for leniency. I'll remind the judge of your clean record, your school achievements, your mother's testimony. It may not change his mind, but it's the best I can do." Malik nodded, though his stomach churned. He knew Alex meant well, but the best I can do didn't sound like the kind of shield he needed today. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Miles stood tall, his suit immaculate, his notes stacked in neat piles. His expression carried that same smug satisfaction that had haunted Malik since the trial began. To him, this wasn't justice. It was theater, and he was playing the leading man. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." Judge Gray entered, black robes flowing, his gaze scanning the room with the calm assurance of a man who already knew the ending. He settled at the bench, shuffled a few papers, and glanced toward the defense table as if Malik were nothing more than another case on his docket, a name on a list that stretched back decades. "Proceed," he ordered. Miles rose first, clearing his throat for effect. "Your Honor, the state has presented overwhelming evidence that the defendant acted with reckless disregard for the law. He was in possession of a loaded firearm, consistent with casings from an attack on one of our officers. We've heard from credible witnesses, including his own peer, that he was seen holding a weapon. This young man represents the very danger our communities face daily. The state requests the maximum penalty." The words settled over the room like a shroud. Malik felt the burn of eyes from every corner, some filled with pity, others with disdain. He clenched his fists under the table, nails digging into his palms. Alex rose slowly, tugging at his tie, his voice shaky but earnest. "Your Honor, my client is 17 years old. He has no prior record. He's a hardworking student, known in his community for helping his mother run her store. What happened here is not the mark of a dangerous criminal, but a young man caught in circumstances beyond his control. I ask the court to consider not just the evidence presented by the state, but the absence of credible, corroborated proof. No fingerprints tied him to the weapon. No officer witnessed him wielding it. There are unanswered questions that should give this court pause." Judge Gray's expression remained unchanged. His eyes flicked briefly to Malik, then back to his papers. "The court has heard the arguments," he said finally. "The matter now is sentencing." A hush fell so heavy it pressed against Malik's chest. His mother gripped the pew in front of her, whispering faster, her voice cracking with each syllable. Malik took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He thought of Reggie's words in the cell. "Don't let them break you." Judge Gray leaned forward, his voice deliberate. "This court finds that the severity of the charges, coupled with the danger posed to the community, warrants the maximum sentence allowable by law." He lifted the gavel, his face unreadable. "Life imprisonment." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to splinter the air itself. His mother let out a sound that was part scream, part sob, collapsing into the arms of a stranger sitting beside her. A ripple of gasps swept through the gallery, some shaking their heads in shock, others nodding grimly as though justice had been served. Malik's world tilted, but he refused to bow his head. He felt the heat of the moment burning into him, and instead of collapsing, he straightened his spine. He stared directly at Judge Gray, his voice rising steady and clear. "Your Honor," he said, cutting through the noise of the room. "You asked where my father was. You wondered if I even had one. I think it's time you found out." The words froze the room. The murmur died instantly, every head turning toward the boy in chains who had just spoken with a confidence that belied his age. The deputies hesitated, unsure whether to silence him. Even Judge Gray leaned back slightly, surprise flickering across his face for the first time in the entire trial. Malik's mother, through her tears, raised her head. She knew the secret her son had held close for so long, and now he was about to place it in the middle of this courtroom like a torch in the dark. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Malik's heart pounded, but his voice didn't waver. I want to make a call. The gavel had fallen. The sentence had been handed down. But Malik wasn't finished. Not yet. The room was still trembling with the echo of the gavel when Malik lifted his chin and spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, slicing clean through the murmurs, the sobs, the shuffle of papers. I want to make a call, he said again, clear and steady. The bailiff stepped forward, frowning. You'll have plenty of time for calls once you're processed, son. Sit down. But Malik didn't sit. He stood taller, the shackles rattling around his wrists, and looked directly at Judge Gray. You asked if I had a father. You asked where he was. Well, let's find out together. The judge smirked, dismissive, but there was the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. By all means, if you think it will change anything, he said, leaning back with his arms crossed, robes folding neatly around him like armor. The deputies exchanged uncertain glances. The prosecutor, Miles, laughed under his breath and muttered, More theatrics. Malik asked the bailiff for his phone. The man hesitated then, with a shrug and a glance at the bench, handed it over. Judge Gray waved his hand, amused, as though indulging a child. Malik's hands shook as he scrolled, but not from fear. Something else was stirring now, a steady fire. He pressed the number he knew by heart. The courtroom was silent, the ringtone echoing in every corner. Then a deep voice answered. This is Marcus Johnson. The sound hit the air like a thunderclap. Several people turned toward each other, whispering. The name was familiar, too familiar. Malik held the phone up, his voice strong. Dad, I need you. Judge Gray just gave me life in prison. On the other end, the man's voice sharpened, commanding. Put me on speaker. Malik obeyed. The words rolled out heavy, calm, but edged with steel. This is Marcus Johnson, Attorney General of the United States. Who is presiding over this case? The courtroom exploded in gasps. Reporters scrambled to their feet, pens flying across notebooks, cameras snapping furiously. Judge Gray froze, color draining from his face. His smirk collapsed into a thin, tight line as the weight of the name settled on him. Miles stammered, his polished confidence cracking. This is highly irregular? Highly irregular? The voice boomed through the speaker, reverberating across the paneled walls. What's irregular is sentencing a minor to life without due process. What's irregular is weaponizing testimony that wouldn't pass scrutiny in any higher court. My son is being railroaded. Judge Gray gripped his gavel, his hand trembling ever so slightly. This is inappropriate. We can't have outside interference in my courtroom. You're right about one thing, Judge, Marcus Johnson replied. This isn't just your courtroom anymore. From this moment on, it's my business. And believe me, I will be reviewing every transcript, every motion, every piece of evidence tied to this case. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. Malik looked at the judge, his chains still binding his wrists, but for the first time, he felt them loosen in his heart. He wasn't alone anymore. Gray tried to recover, adjusting his glasses, but the crack in his composure was too visible. The Attorney General? Your father. He trailed off, fumbling for words that wouldn't come. Reporters shouted questions, their voices tumbling over each other. Is it true? Is this really your father? Attorney General Johnson, are you confirming involvement in this case? Malik's mother had risen to her feet, tears streaming, her hands pressed together like she was praying. But her lips now formed a single word, whispered with awe. Finally. Miles shuffled his notes, his face pale. He muttered something to his aide, who scurried toward the exit. The prosecutor who had once strutted in front of cameras now looked like a cornered man. Marcus Johnson's voice came again, calm but cutting. Son, listen to me. Keep your head up. You did the right thing. This fight isn't over, not by a long shot. And Judge Gray, the judge jerked at the sound of his name. I'll be seeing you very soon. The line went dead. The silence that followed wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the silence of despair or hopelessness. It was the silence of a room that had just witnessed the ground shift beneath its feet. The silence of men who thought they had all the power, realizing they had just pulled a trigger they could never take back. Malik lowered the phone, chains clinking, as he set it gently on the table. He turned his gaze back to the bench. For the first time, Judge Gray wasn't staring down at him with authority. He was staring at a boy he had underestimated, and behind that boy stood a man who could unmake him. Malik's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of victory but of defiance. He whispered under his breath, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear, "This isn't the end. This is the beginning." The courthouse that had once felt like a tomb suddenly pulsed with frantic life. Reporters shouted questions across the aisles. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, and the gallery buzzed like a hive that had been struck. Judge Gray banged his gavel again and again, shouting for order, but the sound was swallowed by the noise. His voice no longer carried the same weight. It was drowned out, stripped of its authority by the single name that had been spoken minutes earlier, Marcus Johnson, Attorney General of the United States. Malik stood silent at the defense table, still shackled, but for the first time he felt the chains did not define him. He watched the panic ripple across faces that had once looked so sure of themselves. Prosecutor Miles bent over his papers, his lips moving quickly as he whispered to an aide, both of them glancing nervously toward the exit. Officer Daniels, sitting stiffly in the witness box, shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading at his temple. The swagger he had carried in with his testimony seemed to be melting into unease. Judge Gray slammed his gavel so hard the wooden handle cracked. "This courtroom will have order," he barked, his face flushed, but the demand rang hollow. His authority had been pierced, and everyone knew it. A sharp voice cut through the commotion. "Your Honor," said Alex, rising from his seat, emboldened for the first time in days. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Given the new revelation, I demand the immediate suspension of sentencing and a review of all evidence in this case." Miles snapped his head up, eyes blazing. "This is absurd. We will not allow theatrics and personal connections to undermine the integrity of this court." "Integrity?" Alex shot back, louder than he had ever dared before. "Is that what you call fabricated testimony? Is that what you call a firearm with no fingerprints, mysteriously pulled from my client's van by a single officer with no corroborating witnesses?" The room gasped, the words sparking like flint against stone. Malik's heart hammered as he looked at his lawyer with newfound respect. For the first time, Alex wasn't just fumbling, he was fighting. Before Gray could silence him, a figure in a dark suit appeared at the back of the courtroom, flanked by 2 federal agents. The man's voice carried, steady and authoritative. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We've been ordered to secure all evidence tied to this case for review." The courtroom erupted again. Reporters nearly climbed over each other to catch the statement, pens flying, cameras flashing, Gray's face drained of color. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Agent Miller strode forward, flashing credentials that glinted under the harsh lights. He handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff. "This is a federal order. The weapon presented as evidence is to be transferred immediately into FBI custody. Furthermore, we will require the original surveillance footage from Jefferson Avenue, not the edited copy introduced here." Miles jumped to his feet. "There is no alternate footage. Then you won't mind us checking?" Miller interrupted smoothly. The gallery roared, voices rising like waves crashing against a seawall. Malik's mother gripped the edge of the pew in front of her, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning hope. She whispered Malik's name as though it were a prayer finally being answered. Daniels looked cornered now, his jaw clenching, his eyes darting to the exits as though calculating a way out. The sweat on his forehead had begun to drip down into the collar of his uniform. Malik recognized the shift. This was no longer the confident officer who had sneered at him on the roadside. This was a man who realized the story he had spun was unraveling. The judge slammed his gavel again, but even he seemed to understand the tide was turning. "This hearing will recess," he said through gritted teeth. "The court cannot proceed under these circumstances until further notice." As the bailiff moved to escort Malik back into custody, Agent Miller stepped closer. "Hold on," he said, voice low but firm. "The defendant will remain under observation, but not processed into prison until this evidence is reviewed." Gray opened his mouth to protest, but the look in Miller's eyes silenced him. For the first time, the judge looked small behind the bench, a man losing his grip on the world he once controlled so easily. Malik turned, chains rattling softly, and looked at the gallery. He saw reporters scribbling feverishly, heard the buzz of words like scandal, federal investigation, and cover-up. He saw his mother crying into her hands, but this time her tears weren't only of despair. They carried something lighter, a flicker of relief. As he was led toward the exit, Malik caught Daniel's eye one last time. The officer's lips pressed into a hard line, his face pale, but Malik thought he saw something flicker there, fear. For the first time, the man who had planted the gun looked like he was the one on trial. The storm had broken. The truth was no longer buried in silence. And though Malik still wore shackles, he knew something had shifted forever. The system that had tried to swallow him whole was beginning to choke on its own lies. The courthouse emptied in a frenzy after the recess was called, reporters rushing to the steps to file their breaking stories, camera crews scrambling to broadcast live updates. Malik was led back into a holding room, but the atmosphere was different now. The deputies who had once walked him with smug certainty avoided his eyes. Their grip on his arms was looser, less certain. It was as if even they could sense the ground shifting beneath them. He sat at the steel table in the corner, chains still heavy on his wrists, when Alex entered. His lawyer's face was pale, but his eyes burned with something Malik hadn't seen before, resolve. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his voice hushed. "Malik, listen to me. Things are moving fast. The FBI agents, they're digging into Daniel's record, and already something doesn't line up. I don't want to give you false hope, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. "This whole case might crack wide open." Malik leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Alex pulled out a thin folder and opened it on the table. There was another complaint against Daniels last year. Evidence missing from the property room, a gun that should have been logged, gone. The complaint was dismissed, but the timing. He tapped the folder with his finger. "It matches the model of the weapon they claimed to find in your van." Malik's chest tightened. "So it really was planted." "I think so," Alex said. "But proving it is the hard part. Right now, the FBI might be our only shot." Before Malik could answer, the door opened again. This time, Agent Miller entered, accompanied by another agent carrying a sealed evidence box. Miller's face was grave, but his tone steady. "Mr. Johnson, we've reviewed the original traffic camera footage from Jefferson Avenue. It was suppressed during discovery, which is in itself a violation. The copy submitted in court was doctored. The original shows your van, yes, but it also shows Officer Daniels opening the back door before backup arrived, carrying something in his hand when he stepped out." Malik's mouth went dry. "The gun," Miller nodded. "It appears that way. We're moving forward with an obstruction investigation. But there's more. We believe your case was used as a distraction to cover for a larger misconduct network. Daniels isn't working alone." Alex sank into the chair beside Malik, stunned. "A network? You mean?" Miller cut him off. "Judge Gray, Prosecutor Miles, there are connections, phone records, financial transactions that suggest this case was never about you alone. It was about protecting themselves and about silencing the truth of an incident they covered up last year. A young man, Jamal Rivers, was shot by police under questionable circumstances. Daniels was there." Miles handled the paperwork. Gray signed off on dismissing the family's lawsuit. Your arrest pulled attention away from that case right when pressure was building. The words landed like hammer blows. Malik stared at the table, rage burning hot in his chest. Jamal. He remembered the name, the whispers at school about the boy who resisted, and the case that disappeared overnight. He remembered the mural painted in Jamal's honor on the side of a bodega wall, candles placed beneath it until the city made them stop. "They used me," he said, his voice raw. "They tried to bury me just to cover up what they already did." Miller's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "That's why we can't let them win. The cover-up is unraveling. And your father, he's been briefed. He's putting pressure on the Justice Department right now. Things are moving in your favor, but it won't be easy. Men like Gray and Miles don't surrender quietly." As if on cue, a guard opened the door to announce Malik's mother had been allowed a brief visit. She rushed in, her face drawn with exhaustion, but when she saw him, her lips quivered with relief. She gripped his shackled hands tightly. "Baby, they're saying the truth is coming out. I saw it on the news. People chanting outside the courthouse, saying your name. You hear me? They're finally listening." Malik's throat tightened, his mother's words both a balm and a dagger. "Ma, I don't want them to just listen. I want them to see what's really happening. Jamal, me, all of us. We're not just names they can throw away." Her eyes glistened. "You hold on, Malik. Don't let them take your spirit. Your father's moving mountains out there, and God's moving bigger ones." The guard signaled that time was up, and she kissed her son's forehead before being let out. Malik closed his eyes, inhaling the trace of her perfume that lingered. It steadied him, gave him something solid to hold. Later that night in his cell, Malik couldn't sleep. Reggie, the older inmate, stirred above him and spoke in a gravelly whisper. "Heard the feds are sniffing around. You're shaking the tree, kid. Careful what falls out." Malik whispered back. "They tried to bury me to protect themselves. I'm not staying buried." Reggie let out a low chuckle. "Good, but remember, when powerful men feel the walls closing in, they fight dirty. Dirtier than you think." Malik lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The truth was finally clawing its way into the light. But he knew Reggie was right. Judge Gray, Miles, Daniels, they wouldn't go down without a fight. And in that fight, he wasn't just a defendant anymore. He was the spark threatening to ignite everything they had tried so hard to hide. As the cell block lights flickered and dimmed, Malik closed his eyes and whispered the vow again, the same one he had made in silence nights ago. "This isn't over. Not until justice is real." The courthouse was a different beast that morning. The crowd outside had doubled, maybe tripled, since the week before. Protesters carried signs with Malik's name on them, some painted hastily with dripping letters, others carefully stenciled with the words "Justice for Malik." Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices colliding in a chorus of breaking news updates. The buzz wasn't just about a sentencing anymore. It was about corruption, about lies, about the FBI prying open a door Judge Gray and Prosecutor Miles had tried to keep locked for years. Inside, Malik sat at the defense table once more, his wrists still bound, though even the deputies who handled him looked less sure of their duty now. Their eyes darted from him to the gallery, where federal agents stood posted along the walls, clipboards in hand, eyes sharp. His mother was there too, her head held high, though her lips trembled as she whispered another prayer. She had dressed carefully in her best church dress, as if to remind the world that her son was more than the caricature painted by the state. When Judge Gray entered, the air shifted. Gone was the smug confidence of a man untouchable. He walked slower, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking briefly toward the agents before settling on the bench. His gavel struck wood, but the sound carried less command than it once had. "Proceed," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Miles rose, but not with the same swagger. His hairline gleamed with sweat, his stack of notes disheveled. "Your Honor," he began, but his voice cracked, and he cleared his throat before continuing. The state maintains that the charges brought against the defendant were justified and supported by the testimony of credible witnesses." "Credible?" Alex cut in sharply, rising to his feet. For once, he didn't look nervous. He looked angry. His tie was loose, his hair disheveled, but his voice carried across the room. "Credible witnesses don't contradict themselves under questioning. Credible evidence doesn't vanish from property rooms and resurface in a 17-year-old's van. Credible officers don't doctor video footage. And credible judges—" He stopped, letting the words hang like smoke. "Well, let's just say credibility isn't what this courtroom has been known for lately." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The federal agents didn't move, but their pens scratched across their papers with deliberate speed. Malik looked at Alex with surprise, almost gratitude. His lawyer was finally fighting with fire. Miles sputtered. "This is outrageous." But before he could finish, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Agent Miller strode in, his presence commanding instant silence. He walked directly to the bench and handed Judge Gray a sealed envelope. "Your Honor, this is a federal subpoena. It pertains to communications between your chambers and the prosecutor's office regarding the suppression of evidence in this case and others." The color drained from Gray's face. His hand trembled as he took the envelope, setting it down as though it were a live wire. "This is highly irregular?" Miller interrupted calmly. "So was a life sentence handed down to a teenager on manufactured evidence." The gallery erupted again, voices crashing together, some shouting Malik's name, others calling for resignations. Judge Gray banged his gavel furiously, his voice cracking. Order! I will have order! But his words no longer carried power. Malik sat straighter in his chair, chains rattling softly. He didn't smile, but his eyes met Gray's, and for the first time the judge looked away first. Then came the moment no one expected. Daniels, sitting near the front, suddenly stood. His face was pale, his hands shaking. I need to say something, he stammered, his voice breaking through the chaos. All eyes turned to him. I planted it. The gun. It wasn't his. I did it. The courtroom went silent, as if the air had been sucked from the room. Daniel's voice shook, but once he started, the words poured out. They told me to. Miles said it would keep the heat off us for the Jamal Rivers case. Judge Gray said the kid fit the profile. I didn't want to, but... He stopped, tears spilling down his cheeks. I did it. Miles shot to his feet, his face twisted with fury. That's a lie. You'll regret. But Daniels cut him off, shouting, You said it yourself. In your office. You said the boy was perfect because his family couldn't fight back. The gallery erupted again, a storm of shouts and gasps. Federal agents surged forward, two of them moving swiftly to flank Daniels, another stepping toward Miles. Judge Gray's gavel pounded helplessly against the bench, his face crimson, his composure shattered. Malik's mother cried out, her hands pressed to her mouth. Malik felt his chest heave, his pulse pounding in his ears. The truth was no longer hidden in whispers. It was spilling into the open, raw and undeniable. Within minutes, the agents placed Miles in cuffs. His protests rang hollow, drowned out by the roar of the crowd outside filtering through the windows. Judge Gray sat frozen, his eyes darting to every corner of the room as if searching for a way out, but there was none. The dominoes had begun to fall, and there was no stopping them now. As Malik was led from the courtroom, still bound in chains but walking taller than ever, he caught sight of Daniels, head bowed, his confession hanging in the air like smoke that could never be pulled back. For the first time since his arrest, Malik felt the faintest shift in his chest. Not freedom yet, not justice yet, but the first crack in the walls that had held him prisoner. And cracks, Malik knew, had a way of spreading until the whole structure came crashing down. The courthouse steps were alive with noise when Malik walked out, this time without the chains that had bound his wrists for weeks. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long beams across the crowd that had gathered. Neighbors, church elders, classmates, strangers who had heard his story and claimed it as their own. Signs bobbed in the air, cameras flashed, chants rose and fell like waves against the marble walls. His mother gripped his hand tightly, tears streaking her cheeks, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You're coming home with me, baby. You're really coming home." Inside the courthouse, everything had unraveled. Daniel's confession, Miles's arrest, and the subpoena dropped into Judge Gray's lap had shattered the facade of control. What once seemed untouchable was now a crumbling tower, brick by brick, as the truth came spilling out in the light of day. Malik had watched the dominoes fall one after another, but standing here now, he felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. He wasn't just free, he had become the spark for something larger. Reporters surged forward, their microphones crowding him, questions flying. Malik, how does it feel to be vindicated? Do you think this will change the system? What comes next? He stood still, blinking against the lights, and then spoke in a voice that was steady but still carried the tremor of everything he had endured. I just wanted to go to school, to help my mom, to live my life. They tried to make me into something I wasn't so they could protect themselves. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever, not if you fight for it. His words echoed across the crowd, picked up and repeated by strangers who had never met him. The chant began low and then grew, his name carried like a banner through the air. Malik lowered his eyes, humbled, almost overwhelmed, but beside him, his mother squeezed his hand, grounding him. Later that night, in a quiet hotel room secured by federal agents, Malik sat with his father for the first time since the storm had broken. Marcus Johnson, the Attorney General, wasn't in his suit anymore. He wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled, his face lined with exhaustion. For once, he wasn't the nation's top lawyer. He was just a father looking at his son. "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner," Marcus said softly, his voice thick. "I thought keeping my distance would protect you. I thought if the world didn't know who you were, they couldn't use you against me. I was wrong. Malik shook his head. Dad, you came when it mattered. That call, it changed everything. But this isn't just about me. They've been doing this to kids like me forever. I was lucky. I had you. Most of them don't. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes steady. And that's why we won't stop here. What happened in that courtroom isn't just your story. It's proof of what we've suspected for years. There will be investigations, reforms, trials, but change doesn't come from the top alone. It comes from people who refuse to bow, even when the system tries to crush them. You showed that kind of courage, son. You reminded me why I took this job in the first place. Malik looked at him, torn between pride and the ache of everything lost, the weeks stolen, the humiliation endured, the friends who had turned away. But beneath it all, he felt the steady hum of resolve. Then, let's make sure Jamal's name is remembered, and all the others they tried to erase. Marcus reached across the table, placing his large hand over Malik's. We will. The weeks that followed moved quickly. Judge Gray was placed on administrative leave, his record combed through by investigators who uncovered years of disproportionate sentencing. Miles resigned in disgrace, his ambitions collapsing overnight. Daniels cooperated with federal agents, his testimony painting a damning picture of collusion and cover-ups. One by one, the dominoes kept falling, and the scandal grew beyond the walls of Eastwood. But for Malik, the most powerful moment came when he returned to his old neighborhood. The mural of Jamal still stood on the bodega wall, candles once again flickering beneath it, this time surrounded by fresh flowers. Children ran up to Malik, tugging at his sleeves, calling his name as though he were some kind of hero. He knelt down, smiling, but his voice was gentle. I'm no hero. I'm just proof that if you stand your ground, the truth can win. His mother watched from the sidewalk, her hands clasped in gratitude, her lips moving in silent prayer. Reggie, the old inmate who had shared his cell, had been transferred and would probably never know the full outcome. But Malik carried his words like a torch. Don't let them break you. They hadn't, and they never would. On a cool spring morning months later, Malik stood on a stage at a community rally, his father in the front row, his mother beside him, the crowd stretching as far as his eyes could see. He held the microphone, his voice steady now, strong enough to carry beyond the square. They told me I was nothing but a statistic. They told me my place was behind bars. But today I stand here free, and I'm telling you, we are not statistics. We are sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, neighbors and friends, and we all deserve justice. The cheers that rose in response shook the air. Malik raised his eyes to the sky, the weight of the past months lifting just enough for him to breathe again. He knew the fight wasn't over. Not for him, not for his community, not for the country. But as the voices of hundreds joined his, he understood something profound. Justice wasn't a gift handed down from above. It was claimed, demanded, carved into stone by those brave enough to stand tall even when the world tried to grind them down. And in that moment, under the bright morning sun, Malik knew he had claimed it.